Hej, Ivar Arpi här. Från och med nu är jag en del av Kvartal. Kul va? Det tycker jag i alla fall. Kanske lite oväntat, eller inte alls oväntat. Jag vet inte. Men nu är jag här i alla fall och jag har tagit med mig mina 2 poddar. För dig som följer Kvartal innebär det att du nu får ytterligare 2 poddavsnitt varje vecka. I podden Rak Höger med Ivar Arpi så intervjuar jag framträdande politiker, akademiker eller författare. Eller bara människor som är intressanta på något sätt. Och i podden Under all kritik som jag har ihop med Anna-Karin så slår vi både näven och handväskan i bordet om aktuella och rykande inaktuella händelser. Och båda poddarna utkommer som sagt en gång i veckan. För dig som ännu inte har blivit prenumerant antingen på Kvartal eller på min Substack Rak Höger så betyder det här att du nu kan få all min journalistik och hela resten av Kvartal med en enda prenumeration. Och just nu så får du första månaden helt gratis om du går till kvartal.se/testa Ivar. Gör det, tycker jag. Testa Ivar. För då kan du lyssna på hela avsnitten av mina 2 poddar, helt reklamfritt dessutom. Och så får du hela Kvartals växande utbud på köpet, inklusive alla poddar i fullversioner och utan reklam, som du kan höra direkt i Kvartals app eller i exempelvis Podcaster eller Spotify. Eller där du väljer att lyssna på din podd. Så gå till kvartal.se/testa Ivar för att testa det nya och växande Kvartal helt gratis första månaden. Tänk själv, som de säger här på Kvartal. Men gör som jag säger och testa Ivar.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
As some of you might know by now, I am an avid reader of Cormac McCarthy. His books have meant and still mean a great deal to me, not just from an aesthetic perspective, but also on a deeper existential level. So today I'm honored to be speaking with one of the foremost scholars of McCarthy's work, Steven Frye, professor of American literature and chair of English at California State University in Bakersfield. Our conversation delves into 2 of McCarthy's most towering works, Meridian, with its bleak, violent world, and The Road, a stripped-down post-apocalyptic story centered on the bond between a father and son. Though these novels seem vastly different, they ask strikingly similar questions. Can decency survive in a world where power, destruction, and loss seem inevitable? We also explored the concept of weak theology in McCarthy's work. How can a God allow such evil to happen? In The Road, McCarthy seems to ask whether the fire of human compassion can endure in a universe that offers nothing in return. Our discussion also touched on McCarthy's more romantic vision of the West in All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing. We reflected on the impossibility of returning to an imagined past of purity and belonging as McCarthy's characters grapple with modernity's harsh realities. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, I highly recommend visiting Steven Frye's website at stevenfrye.org, where you'll find his writings. I also suggest checking out his novel Dogwood Crossing, which is a great read. But now, let's get into today's episode. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Steven Frye, to Rak Höger.
Well, thank you for having me, Ivar.
It's a great privilege to have you on. I was bragging yesterday. I was at a panel about something completely different, and I was saying tomorrow I'm going to interview one of the foremost experts on Cormac McCarthy literature and the Western genre, and they looked at me like,
why are you always talking about Western books? Like, why are you always even my like the music to my podcast is from like spaghetti Western song? Like, what are you, do you think you're a cowboy? Like, I wish I was, but I'm not. But but how did you get into Cormac McCarthy? When did you start reading him, and how did you why did you focus so much of your academic life on him?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I'm from the West. I'm in California. And so early on when I was in graduate school, I developed an interest in the literature of the American West. When I went back east to Purdue University to do my doctorate, I began studying the literature of the American frontier. And in the early 19th century, people like James Fenimore Cooper, William Gilmore Simms, and other authors of that variety. And I became very involved in the study of the American Romantics, specifically Herman Melville. And incidentally, Moby Dick is in fact, arguably at least, Cormac McCarthy's favorite book, one of our foremost Western writers. And so there was a natural connection between Cormac McCarthy and some of the works that I was studying, when I was in graduate school. And then in 1992, like a lot of people, I discovered All the Pretty Horses. Read it, was immediately enraptured with it, and then moved immediately back and read Blood Meridian, and then read through everything. And it didn't take me very long to say, this is an area, maybe the area for a while, where I'm going to focus my study. There's so much to try and understand with Cormac McCarthy. It just never ends. And that's true of a lot of the writers of the West. And he participates, of course, in both traditions.
I think I was introduced to Blood Meridian in the most lowbrow way possible. I think it was. I think I was like watching a short clip on YouTube from a podcast with like an ex-Marine or something like that. And he was asked by another very muscular man, like, "Oh, so do you have any books you recommend?" And he's like, "Oh, I always return to Blood Meridian." And I was just, I picked it up, and I hadn't read fiction in a long while. Because I read so much nonfiction and in my work, it was like almost a religious experience, because I'm a writer, so I write all the time, every day. And of course, I'm not a writer in that regard. Like, I don't write fiction, but I write every day. I write and I publish. And then it just felt like somebody's using language in a way that is completely different from what I'm not, to say that I'm a writer when you can write like this. It felt like my brain was hijacked by his use of words, and it was almost religious. And I've been nagging people, like pestering them with Blood Meridian, like throwing Blood Meridian through their window, almost like, read this.
There's a fascinating confluence, and that is a genius and a talent like McCarthy in particular, and both the South and particularly in this context, the West, because when you unleash an author of his ability on a landscape that we find here in the West, you get exactly that kind of almost religious experience as a reader. And he's, of course, it's humbling. I write as well, and as do you, and it's a humbling experience. It's one of those things that really challenges us, right? When we, especially in my case, when I write about great writers, it makes you, you have to be careful to not permit it to cripple you. Because you almost find yourself saying, especially if you venture into fiction as I have, if you find yourself saying, "Oh, kind of, what's the point? I mean, why do it? If you can't, even come close to meeting a standard like this." But at the same time, I think the thing about McCarthy is that he does have a certain amount. You say it's kind of a religious experience. He sort of invites that. I wouldn't put him into any kind of religious category per se. He deliberately stays out of any kind of heterodoxy, but at the same time, he's fascinated with those kinds of questions, and he courts it in his prose.
Yeah, And the reason I think that these the way I discovered Blood Meridian through these very masculine, very muscular men who have seen combat and all the stuff, and that's like. That was a book you can actually like recommend Blood Meridian and not be like effeminate. I think that's like one of the, if you say like Pride and Prejudice in that context, you wouldn't get away with it. But Blood Meridian is like, it's fun. Okay, that's a good book. Yeah. But I think one of the things, I mean, I've tried to read scholarly work on Blood Meridian because I'm very interested in it, but it's sort of you start reading it and you realize like the main character has a terrible like family story, like very desolate, like with a father, and he leaves, and then he takes up with this gang, and it's immediately very violent, and immediately you are shaken by certain things, and you introduce these characters, but it's you have a sense of hope that it will sort of work out in the end, and so because you can't stop yourself, I can stop. I know it probably won't end well, but like I really want it to. And then it's sort of, I think one of my best friends started reading it and he gave it up because he felt like he was being bullied by the story, like it was too harsh, and I guess I'm more morbid than he is. I didn't stop in time.
Yeah. Your friend is not uncommon. Even Harold Bloom, the famous literary critic, said he had to put it down, and it took him a couple times to pick it up and finally finish it. And then, of course, he's responsible in part for elevating McCarthy's reputation just by saying that it was one of the best books that he's read and one of the best novels of the 20th century. It does bludgeon you in certain ways, but I think your instinct or desire for hope is on the one hand natural, right? I mean, that's why you turn the page, right? Ultimately we want to see decent things happen, and it sort of depends upon how you read the novel, whether you find that hope. On the one hand, if you just read it strictly in terms of plot, the judge, Holden, is dancing at the end and the kid is dead. So that's not a particularly hopeful or desirous ending. On the other hand, if you read it in terms of the kid's response to the judge all along, then if the question becomes not the survival of the kid, but the survival of some kind of decency, resistance, and even a kind of guarded heroism, if that's how you're thinking about hope, then the fact that the kid finally says to the judge, one of his last pronouncements to the judge is, "You are nothing." And if that kind of resistance is possible in the world, and in this case, the world of Blood Meridian, there's grounds for hope. There's grounds for saying, you know what, in the midst of all this madness and violence, there is such a thing as a human decency that may not survive the individual body, but survives writ large. So. Yeah,
and this character, Judge Holden, when he's introduced, he comes into, and it's like, it's very, as I comment on politics a lot, this is very pertinent to my line of work, so to speak. But he comes into a tent and he accuses, like it's a sermon, and he accuses the preacher that he has committed unspeakable crimes in the last town he was in, and like he eggs the crowd on, and it ends in terrible bloodshed and like chaos, and then the kid witnesses this and asks him, well, what did he do? No, I just made that up, basically. And then but that character, Judge Holden, immediately when he's introduced, you realize this is something, and then this is something special, a special character, and some have likened him to sort of I think the term they've used is he's an archon in a Gnostic universe, so to speak. So if there's the material world is evil, and according to that worldview, and then Judge Holden, he's the most he's the most competent in almost every area. He has endless knowledge, and but just the fact that he's dancing in the end, he's a great dancer, just small detail. And for some reason he has small feet, and that makes it creepier. He's a giant. but they're very competent, like the sort of a dark and the back, the dark side of the Enlightenment figure. And what do we make of what do you make of that character? And do you agree with the analysis that he's sort of an archon, so to speak?
I think that's a totally legitimate reading, but there's a point in the novel where the narrator says that he cannot be reduced to any one system, for he will not go. So McCarthy's warning us that you have at it. Think of him as a Gnostic archon or a Gnostic demiurge. Think of him as a Satan figure. Associate him with Friedrich Nietzsche. Associate him with a kind of modern critique of the Enlightenment. All these things are reasonable, but McCarthy intends the character to embody those systems while rising above them. There is a scene, though, this idea of the Gnostic worldview being manifest there. I think that's palpably true. And when I say that, there's a scene where the kid is having a dream, and he dreams of the judge standing over a coiner as the coiner stamps out coins that are essentially sort of figurative representations of chance, determinism, all the kinds of possibilities that can play out in the world. And it's at that moment that he seems to be almost deliberately representing him either as a Gnostic archon or the Gnostic demiurge, that force within the material world that controls all things, that is evil. One of the ways to, or destructive at the very least, one of the ways to, again, go back to this idea of some kind of redemption is to remember that outside of the Gnostic, the world that's controlled by the Gnostic demiurge, there is this light, this kind of divinity that represents the good. It is outside. It doesn't control the world that is dominated by the demiurge. But in the epilogue of Blood Meridian, there is a series of travelers who are striking fire, that is light, out of the stones of the earth. And so there is this glimmer that is represented in the very obtuse and strange epilogue, and at the same time in the, I'll call it guarded resistance of the kid, that suggests something of that light and that possibility in this potentially, or at least partly, Gnostic configuration. In terms of your discussion of, he's very clearly a manifestation of the Enlightenment gone bad. In other words, he represents not only the rapacious aspects of westward expansionism, which is arguably a post-Enlightenment phenomenon, but also he's learned in every way. He's scientifically oriented, and he demonstrates how the kind of knowledge that the Enlightenment prized does not necessarily lead to a perfect world as the Enlightenment hoped, a progressive world. Instead, it can lead to rapaciousness and destruction. And so it is a kind of modern warning not to reject the basic principles of the Enlightenment, but to reject the idea that the Enlightenment will necessarily lead to a kind of apotheosis of human accomplishment, ethics, and knowledge.
Yeah, I think one of the scenes in the book that speaks to the analysis you laid forth is when they come to a stone formation or a rocky formation, and there are fossils on the wall, and the judge, he makes a rendering in his sketchbook, perfect rendering of the fossil, and then he erases the fossil and then he says, "Nothing exists unless I give my approval." I'm just quoting out of memory, but it's something like that, and it's sort of the way in which we have a lot of knowledge about species that we've made extinct over the years. You could make that interpretation, at least. I just think that there are. I read The Road more recently, and I'm not sure if I did it in the right way, because I was doing it lying on reading it on my Kindle, lying next to my two sleeping kids, and it was sort of a harrowing experience, because it's of course about the father and the son. They're never given names, and they are many have seen the film. Of course, I haven't seen the film yet because when it came out, I thought it was like I was in a sort of a depressive phase, and I was like, I'm not going to be able to take it. And then I read the book, and I felt like I should really watch the film now, but I really love the book, so I don't want the film to push out my experience of the book. Anyway, they travel through a wasteland, and an unnamed disaster has made basically the whole world barren, and they are assailed by cannibals, and it's like everything is not very, very little that is going well for humanity in this world. But they are the father is trying to protect his son, and he has sort of a code that he's repeating, and there is sort of it's like if this is the way I've thought about it, like Blood Meridian presents a world in which might is right, like it's the world of the Archon, the demiurge, and then he constructs the world in the road, and like, okay, but if you empty the world of all humanity, is there any reason or any like outer sign of goodness? Is there any way for good to be in the world? So it's also almost like he's trying to answer the question posed in Blood Meridian. I'm not sure if you agree with it, but what do you make of the contrast between the two books and how it views sort of the way for hope?
I think that's a very interesting way to look at the relationship between the two books, and I think that you're onto something. I think that what you have to note in Blood Meridian is there's an absence of intimate relationships. The judge seeks a kind of perverse intimacy with the kid, says that, I could have loved you like a son. But at the same time, that relationship is not there. What you find in the road, and incidentally to your experience, when the road first came out, I read it in just before it actually came out. I was able to the publisher was provided some review copies or something, I don't remember, and I read it in that context. And my son happened to be exactly the same age, or roughly the same age as the kid, and it is a devastating experience because it's a story of human intimacy. And so it's in the relationship of the father and the son, which is a two-way relationship. There's devotion on both sides, that we find somewhat of an answer to the lack of that intimacy in Blood Meridian, and where we find some kind of hope and redemption or possibility. Remember that the father says to the boy, after the father has killed one of the cannibals, and the boy is bothered by that, to say the least, the father says, "My job is to take care of you. I was appointed to do that by God. I will kill anyone who touches you. Do you understand?" Now you could say that, I say that to you, you can say that to any parent, and they understand, right? They understand what that means. It's not the love between the father and the son is not a sort of pleasant, effervescent, beauteous kind of love. It's I will kill anyone who touches you love. And that is consistent with the world of Blood Meridian, consistent with the world of the road, and yet it remains love.
Yeah. And it's sort of the kid in it was, now that you spoke of it, that it struck me like he's also not, he's the kid in the road, he's the son. There's a similarity there, but they always say something, are we the good guys? Like they ask if we are the good guys, so it's something they repeat, but something, I don't know, I feel very much closer to the father than the son, and I guess it's because I am a father. I guess it's maybe because the father is more practical. He doesn't see much hope, but he has to carry on, and it's like I don't know. You see all the threats in the world, and you try to protect. Will I be strong enough to protect my kids? Like stuff like that. Oh, do we have enough money to buy Christmas gifts? I mean, it's more mundane stuff like that oftentimes, but the kid he says, you often speak about we tell these stories about being nice, we tell these stories about being generous, being the good guys, but they encounter people along the way, and because the world is so threatening, the father often says, no, we can't help that. We cannot help him, or we can't give that away. We need it for ourselves. And so the son is angry or accusing his father of like, why are we not living up to our ideals? And how should you interpret that? Do you think, like the relation there between the rules, but they're not following them, and the son is admonishing the father, like, why are we not living up to this?
Well, I think McCarthy is posing it as a question in the context of a naturalistic or a brutal world. The world of the road is not wholly different than the world that we actually live in, right? I mean, there's still the same kind. Everything that happens in the road happens in our world, whether it be cannibalism or whether it be, conflict or murder or anything else, or starvation, right? All these things are possible in the world we live in, even before a kind of apocalyptic event. And the core question is ethics. How do we respond ethically to the world? McCarthy once said in an interview, he said, if we are engaged in some kind of philosophical endeavor, some kind of intellectual journey, and ethics aren't at the core of what we are all about, then what is the point? And while I think in the end he leans in the direction of the kid's point of view, he presents the father's point of view. We have to survive. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to be selfish in order to survive. And the son, the boy, says, let's help people, and kind of wants to suggest that there's no reason to go on if we can't help people. And in the end, they do help people occasionally. And when that happens, ultimately the boy survives. And so the father, you'll remember, it has a fascinating and tortured interchange with his wife who has committed suicide. And she has decided that there is no point in going on. And she basically wins that argument. And goes off and kills herself with a shard of obsidian. The fact that the father doesn't use the bullets in the gun to kill himself and his son, which is the mother's argument, because they will be raped and eaten if they are caught. The fact that he doesn't do that, it's because in his deepest heart, he can't, even though it remains a rational response to their circumstances. And so in that context, there is a sense that you go on regardless in this life, regardless of the constraints, the violence, and everything else, and you seek some kind of decency. And that's what the boy claims and argues and lives out.
Basically, I think the son is one part of me thinks he's an idiot, and like he's basically, he doesn't understand the world he lives in. That's one part of me, like the cynic in me, like of course the father is right. But then I read, I don't know if it was you or if it was someone else, or it might be you and someone else, but like if you posit that the father is sort of the Old Testament and the son is the New Testament, and so there's like always an argument against the good, because the good is most, like I said, you're being a sucker, and you don't want to be a sucker. And being generous, that's like inviting people to take advantage of you. So it's sort of like, when I read it, I felt it was a sort of a challenging book, not in the it was not complicated in the prose or anything. I mean, if you go back and read older works, it can be a little bit challenging as a non-English speaker, at least. Morally, it was challenging to read.
You have to, one of the things I think you're right to point out the naivete of the boy. He's presented very deliberately by McCarthy as a kind of innocent. He talks about good guys and bad guys and carrying the fire and all of these things that connote childhood. And so, to associate him with a kind of unrealistic response to the world, I think is quite reasonable. At the same time, it seems to me that the only other alternative is to, at the very least, be selfish, at the very worst, become one of the bad guys. And that's the thing that the kid sort of suggests, and that is there's no reason to go on if we can't maintain this decency. And in terms of how the plot plays out, again, he does survive and he does find other decent people. You're right to your analogy, or to talk about the Father as Old Testament and the Son as New Testament. The Son is very clearly presented to us as a messianic figure, right? He's a golden chalice. He is the one. The Father says early on second or third page, he says, he knew only that the child was his warrant. If he is not the word of God, God never spoke. So however McCarthy is configuring the divine, or pondering the possibility of some kind of divine element in the universe, if that element exists, he associates it with the Son. And if you think of many of our ethical traditions that find themselves constituted out of religious traditions, you find unlikely figures, the Buddha, Christ, or other figures who are standing against that world and trying to respond to it in some way that is unlikely to survive, and yet somehow it does, at least in our traditions.
I also think about...
Om drömmar har en hemstad så heter den VM i fotboll. Sverige är nu en del av denna dröm och miljoner blågula hjärtan slår i exakt samma takt. Ladda ner Expect-appen och förstärk din VM-upplevelse med vår helt nya sportbok. Som ny spelare får du även en matchad bonus på upp till 1500 kronor. Välkommen till nya Expect. Åldersgräns 18 år, se regler och villkor på expect.se.
The Father, he remembers the world as it was. So if you're a part of the secular political traditions, he should be the one who remembers civilization, remembers how good we were, so to speak. In some post-apocalyptic movies or literature, you have a sort of nostalgia for the present when you read it. Like, we used to be so good, and look how what we've become. We've become these zombies, or But here it's the other way around. It's the Son. He has no memory of the world before, but he's the one who so it's inexplicable, really, that he is. He is the one who's generous, but he doesn't know about the welfare state. He doesn't remember those things. He only knows this very, very bleak world, and yet he's the one. But I just wanted to make I'm not sure if this detour is too far, but there's of course Cormac McCarthy wrestles with these questions throughout his books, but in The Crossing, you also have, which is part of the Border trilogy, and you have the story of the man who loses his faith, and it's a priest that Billy Parham encounters, who tells this story, and because he loses his son in an earthquake, and he just feels abandoned. He feels abandoned by God. It's not that he doesn't believe in God, it's that he doesn't believe anymore in God's benevolence. So it's like the Theodicea problem, and it's a very, very Cormac McCarthy-esque story, but it sort of poses it sort of runs throughout this sort of like the road is sort of an answer to it, perhaps. Right. I don't know. What do you make of that?
The line is, he said, it is not that he ceased to believe in God, it's that he came to believe terrible things of him. And I think that's what's so fascinating when you think about metaphysics or metaphysical possibilities in McCarthy's work. And that's why I always like to use the word heterodox, because McCarthy entertains all possibilities, right? He entertains a kind of nihilistic notion, an atheistic conception of things. You've got characters that articulate themselves in precisely that way, in compelling ways. But even as he presents the possibility of God or the divine, he doesn't necessarily present that possibility as beneficent, benevolent, decent, caring. He may or may not be those things. And those are, as we enter into those kinds of discussions, those are the questions that are often left out, right? And that is, why assume that we live in a universe where where the God of the man who is losing his faith in a decent God, why should we have faith in the omnipotence of the divine? Why can't the divine be a process that is unfolding? And McCarthy explores all of that, even as he entertains the possibility that we exist in a material universe and that's all. And he does entertain that possibility. These are the questions that have always compelled me in my scholarship in McCarthy.
And there's a sense in how he, I've never, I don't recall having come across an author that can make me have a sense of beauty in what he describes. You see it, and you see it in a new way, and it's often the natural world. And I grew up. I'm not an American, but I sort of feel like one part of at least my boyhood imagination that's continued on is sort of the American West. And so when you read All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, it's you're right there with all these heroes and these landscapes, but he takes it to another height. But when he describes the wolf, for example, in The Crossing, Billy Parham is, instead of killing the wolf that's been trapped in one of the wolf traps, he takes it and he wants to release it into the wild, and it's a really very stupid thing to do, but I'm very glad that Billy did it, because we could tag along and read about it. But then he describes the wolf's eyes glow like gate lamps to a world burning on the shore of an unknowable void. And in All the Pretty Horses, the narrator likens a horse's breath to news from another world, and you sort of get that sense it just reminded me also about the ending, after the ending in The Road, when you read about the trout in the streams and of a world to become, and you get this sort of a sense of a mystery and a miracle, and also the sense in all these cases that it's either destroyed by humanity or it's sort of locked away from we cannot really. Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, first of all, that the sequence in The Crossing, the wolf sequence in The Crossing, is just devastatingly beautiful. And it's one of a number of examples in McCarthy's work, his treatment of the horses, his treatment of landscape in Blood Meridian, all of those things. I think for all of the ugliness that human beings introduce into the world, or all of the ugliness that might be endemic to the world outside of human beings, when we consider just the basic kind of rapaciousness and brutality of nature, there is this rendering of the beautiful outside of any kind of religious considerations, this rendering of the beautiful that is sort of hard to match in any writer that I've ever read, and makes, McCarthy's challenged oftentimes, or considered oftentimes, as a writer of violence and darkness and brutality and preoccupied with evil, all of those things. But ultimately, he presents us a world that's really worth living in, and at some level worth sustaining. And it's in that rendering of landscape, the beauty of landscape, and even in the beauty of certain human relationships. You see that in All the Pretty Horses as John Grady Cole is coming back from Mexico, and he meets a group of workers, and they're there in a kind of communion. As Billy Parham encounters at the end of the novel a group of workers and a boy who gives him water. All of that is in the context of a world that is rendered with such exquisite beauty and power and evocativeness, and in such an otherworldly way that it again, the answer when you close a McCarthy book is it's worth being here. For all of what he's just presented, it's really worth being here.
Yeah, I totally agree. But it's sort of at the same time then that if you take All the Pretty Horses, John Grady Cole, I was sort of, I didn't know, I must have known sometime, but in Sweden we have double names. So it's John Grady. It's basically, there are many people, at least in the older generations, you have a double names. But first I didn't know that, so I thought it was John Grady, like that was his surname. Until I listened to Reading McCarthy, the podcast, and there was like a sequence where they were like admonishing people for doing that. So I was like, oh, they're like, it's like in Sweden, they have a double name. Okay. But he's a romantic. He's from a long line of cattle herders, and he had a ranch, but his mother is selling the ranch, and his father is devastated by the war, and so he and his friend, they are teenagers, and they want to live the life that they know, or at least their ancestors, like a good life in their view is being like a cowboy, so to speak, but it's not the cowboy of the movies, but a cattle herder and a horseman, and so they go south to Mexico, and it doesn't work out that well. And it's sort of, I mean, most of us can go on it's a much more hardcore way. In Sweden, 20 years ago when I was young, you were supposed to go on an interrail through Europe. But this interrail is a little bit more hardcore.
Right. You know, there's something noble in the kind of romanticism that we find in John Grady. We have to remember that he's 16 years old. So, and it's hard to even process that even as you're reading. And so there's a certain, again, kind of innocence and nobility to that. But you're absolutely right that maybe, even though there seems to be a kind of softening coming from Blood Meridian to All the Pretty Horses, we've now entered into the 20th century, the mid-20th century, around the time of World War II, and in the Border Trilogy broadly, throughout and into the Cold War. And John Grady's worldview does not survive. It's deeply tragic, right? That kind of romanticism becomes impracticable in the modern world, and maybe it always has been. So we hold it out as an ideal that's sort of charming in some ways, but you're right to point to its impracticality. Now, I think in many ways, John Grady's trajectory, the failure of his worldview to in any way really triumph, at least in terms of the outcome of his life. It may triumph in other ways, but at least in terms of the outcome of his life, might be one of the darker moments in McCarthy's work, because it's very much about how modernity, at the very least, if not the world broadly construed, makes that kind of idealism impractical.
Yeah, it's like the wolf. We're spoiling all the books here, but but like when the wolf dies in The Crossing, it's sort of a foreshadowing of the, so to speak. It's like you don't belong in this world anymore.
Yeah.
Another book that I very much enjoyed was Lonesome Dove. It's by another author, Larry McMurtry, but it sort of also speaks to the same sort of these. It's a totally different book, totally different atmosphere and everything. But there you find like also the modernity is encroaching upon these very competent men, who's of course they're Texas Rangers. They're very competent. They have defeated the Comanches. They're accomplished in the ways of violence, everything like that, but they have not made a civil career after that. And then they like, okay, we're going to make we're going to make a cattle run for North, where the lawyers haven't divided up the land yet. And it's some similarity to the sort of romanticism in the John Grady character. Of course, it's a different time and everything, but they meet. They all. It's also a tragic story. It's the West. You're an expert in the Western genre. I'm also thinking about Once Upon a Time in the West. Also, like all the heroes and all the cool guys in that story, they end up dead, and then when the railway comes, everything is over.
Right. Well, it's always, the Western, when it's rendered, I think at its best, it's about loss. And that's certainly what Lonesome Dove is very much about. It's true that our characters, Woodrow Call and Augustus McCrae, are heroic characters that we admire. But when and they are strong, and they are violent, and at the same time, they're resilient. All of those things. They're noble in all of those ways. Notice when they confront their antagonist, Blue Duck. Blue Duck ultimately is killed, but not by them. He always evades them. And in fact, he says that I have killed, murdered, and raped people all over your territory, and you've never gotten a good look at me until now. That's Blue Duck talking to Woodrow Call when he's in jail finally in the end. And so even though Blue Duck meets a kind of just fate after all of his brutality, it's not at the hands of our heroes. So it's a mitigated heroism. They don't win in the end. And when you look at and of course, we know what happens to Augustus McCrae in Lonesome Dove. You're right, we're giving it all away. But as in subsequent novels, when we follow Woodrow Call onward, he experiences the same kind of diminution and evolution. He becomes an old man. He's blind. He's taking care of a little girl. He's being taken care of by one of his former employees or fellow workers, and so their heroism is mitigated by a West that is defined by change, violence, loss, and the closing of the frontier. So I think, Blood Meridian and Lonesome Dove came out right around the same time. I actually read Lonesome Dove first and was much more familiar with McMurtry before I encountered McCarthy. But I've always thought of the two novels as parallel and presenting the world really in very, very similar ways. Remember, you have the same kind of you don't have it rendered as vividly, but it's the same kind of world. You have characters like Glanton in Lonesome Dove. You have brutal people, renegades, and others that are outside the context of civilization and are permitted free play in a very, very brutal Western space. So I think that the two novels parallel quite reasonably.
Yeah, and it's when I live in the countryside now, and of course, on the farm that I live, it's not an active farm anymore, but it used to. So you have like abandoned houses all around, because you must be able to house your workers around your farm. And those houses, most of them were abandoned in the 50s, 60s, and people moved into town. And so I've checked on like who lived where, and I'm trying to like collect the names and like in the old texts. But this farm like might have employed like 40 people or 20 people, and now it's like one farmer can go around with his tractor on all the fields, and I don't think he makes a lot of money, but he like there's still people around tilling the earth. But you have all these old machines lying around, or old machinery everywhere, and somebody used to work those and know how to do it, and nobody does anymore because you don't need them. And these characters are the same, like they were necessary, or they were like the prerequisite of populating Western Texas was defeating Comanches. So you needed Augustus McCrae, Woodrow Call, otherwise, and people like them. Otherwise, the settlers wouldn't have been able to settle there. You could argue the morality of it. You could argue like all those things, but that's just the reality. Like the Texas Rangers and then the army. But then in the end, as you say, when he's in like Woodrow Call, when he's an old man, he's not respected. He's not like, oh, this is the hero who made it possible, or like, oh, you're the pioneer. But and it's basically you have a scene in Lonesome Dove where it's much more satisfying because they're being challenged in town, and Augustus McCrae like slaps him with his pistol. I'm not sure if
it's the bartender. Yeah, it's the bartender.
Yeah, the bartender. Yeah, because he's being disrespected. Like, who are you guys? I don't give a damn. You still have to. And he like, you don't talk. And then you realize that's the first time in the book you realize, oh, so this is sort of it's sort of like you've only seen the lion in the cage, and now he's gone out of the cage. Okay, so this is his natural habitat. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a very satisfying scene, but it's not satisfying with Woodrow later on. No,
not at all. Not at all. And one of the things that you're pointing to as you talk about where you live is that what happens in the West, in these novels and in reality, is really a product of modernity. And the West has just become the space that much of the Western world, Europe and everyone, has looked to as the exemplar of what's happening there too. Right? So what's happening in your space is the same thing that's happening in the American West. The American West just becomes an interesting and fascinating place to tell that story. That is a universal 20th century story, it seems to me, in any case. It's beautiful in a way to see the real humanity in Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call, and the humanity that's in their flaws, because they're not the same. It's often been said that Woodrow is the stoic, the person who is about work and resistance, and Augustus McCrae is the Epicurean, the person who embraces life and joy and pleasure, and they're constantly battling one another on those kinds of terms. How do we go about living a life? How do we constitute meaning? For Augustus McCrae, it's a sip of whiskey or a sip of buttermilk, or the taste of a good piece of food, or a laugh. For Woodrow Call, it's building something like a ranch. And those are two impulses that we could associate not only with the West, but with sort of anywhere, and specifically the 20th century, as people have had the freedom to pursue those kinds of things.
I mean, Cormac McCarthy and Larry McMurtry are also similar in the way that they are the heroes don't start families and dynasties. Very few women who stay around for much time in Cormac McCarthy's novels, and in Border Trilogy, it's a failed romance in both All the Pretty Horses and Cities of the Plain, and in the Crossing, it's Billy Parham doesn't have much luck there either. And in Lonesome Dove, of course, there is possibility, but it's sort of how the kids, there are no kids being born in these novels. Like there's no, and I'm not sure what to make of that. It's sort of maybe that's why, like, it's the toxic masculinity of me is like, oh, I love these books, I love these guys, but they never become good fathers. They don't build anything like that. And why is that, do you think?
That's a really difficult question. On the one hand, it's not exclusive to McCarthy and McMurtry, right? I mean, so many of the hero figures in American mythology find themselves, isolated in that way and don't participate in the same way that others do. But it does seem true that in McMurtry, remember that Augustus McCrae is in love with Claire Allen. She's married another man, and she's married the other man because he's practical and he can provide her with a living, but she really loves Gus. So there is this very strange sense in which when you join together in a relationship, there is some kind of compromise of heroism that takes place. And I think that may be a flaw in the mythology. Right? Because that's not the lives that we all, sort of typically live. I think it's represented as more, I would say, romantic and idyllic in Lonesome Dove, whereas I think it is conceived when we see the male characters and how their lives play out, when they are not when they don't marry or have children, they don't play out all that well. And we see the alternative possibilities there. We have all kinds of women characters, especially in the Border Trilogy, that are figures of nurture and respect and strength and resolve. And so it's very clear that women characters and women in the world are essential to its survival and its sustenance in the long term. But the characters, for whatever reason, never seem to embrace them fully as they could, and that ends up being part of the sadness of their lives, I think.
And why do you think in the Western genre? I'm thinking about I mostly grew up watching a lot of spaghetti westerns, so it's Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson, and although of course I idolized them as you do when you're a boy, and then it becomes perhaps more complicated. But that's I think it's the uncompromising strength, and also of course the violence is important for like on an instinctual level to like respect the male hero, that he has the capacity at least in many of these circumstances. But many of them, as you say, they ride away in the end. And it also comes again in a lot of the country western genre music, like Saddle Tramp by Marty Robbins. Like you meet a new girl everywhere. In Sweden we have a lot of like sailor songs that are very popular, and it's also like a new girl in every haven, like you go around on the seas. It's basically the same theme, and it's sort of I don't know if it's a masculinity thing, and but it's also it's not the same as the cowboy in the white hat winning and then starting that sort of disappeared or became much less important.
Well, I think that it's really relevant that you raise the issue of the spaghetti western and the tradition that it spawned after Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood, especially. One critic by the name of Richard Slotkin in a book called Gunfighter Nation, a book that treats the western in film very, very deeply. He calls it the alternative western, and it emerges out of the Vietnam era. And if we think about the western, it is in many ways the American morality play. In other words, it's been the genre where we have worked out our national ideals. And so in the 40s and 50s, in the midst of that era, you have a lot of this white hat kind of representation and values. But in the wake of and in the midst of, and Sergio Leone is coming out in the late 60s in the midst of the Vietnam War, Clint Eastwood picks that up in films like The Outlaw Josie Wales, High Plains Drifter, and these are morally ambiguous characters. Yeah, we as young men, we admire them, but as we get older, we recognize that moral ambiguity. We know that they're out for themselves. We know that they're not perfect, at least at an ethical level. And I think that's what makes them so compelling and fascinating, is the fact that unlike someone like Gus McCrae, who is not so much morally ambiguous as he is just not necessarily triumphant, but we get that darkness in these figures. We get that sense that that they don't represent ideals to follow exclusively, and that is part of what makes them mythic in a very, very complicated world in the post-Vietnam era, where the United States has had to contend with its own complicity in some of the worst geopolitical realities.
And in the 1992 film by Clint Eastwood, The Unforgiven, De skoningslösa in Swedish. I don't know. We used to translate all the English movies. We don't anymore, thankfully. They're very silly translations, but there is like it's the West, like the way Gene Hackman, who's the crook, so to speak, the bad guy, the way he sort of understands violence. He has it all figured out. Like he has his speeches and like how it's going to go down. And sort of Clint Eastwood is sort of he's maybe the Archon of that movie in one way, because he comes in and just shatters the illusions of your control. So it's sort of like Gene Hackman is they are like, we can control all this. This is the way we're going to go. We're going to do this and we can do that. And we're just going to do a little surgical intervention here. We're going to do, and then it's just, no, you're going to explode in your face and it's going to be over like this, because that's the way it works. And it sort of shares the heroic view of himself, I guess, as well, a little bit.
Well, in that film, a brilliant film, the young boy has finally done what he's been wanting to do, and that is to kill he's a bounty hunter, or he's acting as a bounty hunter, and he kills one of the men who has been involved in the violent acts against the prostitutes. And the boy is sort of tortured by what he's just done. But finally, the boy says, well, I guess they had it coming. And William Money, the Clint Eastwood character, takes a drink of whiskey and then says, we all got it coming, kid. Right? So there's a sense that we are all complicit in this world. And that's why the film is called Unforgiven. Right? It's about the moral complicity even of the hero.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for to try to get you to basically write another one of your books in my podcast. I can just print the transcript and put it out. No, I've written this book. It was not Steven Frye at all. But I'm going to let you go because I've already taken a lot of your time, and many thank yous for being part of Rak Höger, Steven Frye.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden, och du hittar alltihop på www.enrakhöger.se. Och har ni några frågor eller synpunkter så tveka inte att höra av er på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka igen. Och där tog det stopp. Ja, Ivar Arpi här igen. Om du vill höra resten av den här podden så måste du vara prenumerant på Kvartal, som jag nu har blivit en del av. Om du redan är prenumerant på min Substack Rak Höger så blir du nu automatiskt prenumerant på Kvartal och kan logga in i Kvartals app med din mailadress. Så kolla din mail för mer information. Men om du inte ännu är prenumerant på Rak Höger eller Kvartal så kan du testa att bli det i en månad helt gratis på kvartal.se/testa Ivar. Så för att testa mig, mina poddar, mina texter och resten av Kvartals texter och poddar gratis första månaden, gå till kvartal.se/testa Ivar så kan du börja med att höra resten av den här podden.
Nu är vår Leo Jackpot uppe i 480 miljoner kronor. På Leo Vegas. Ladda ner vår app och spela de mest populära spelen som Pirates 4, Lightning Roulette och Starburst. Välkommen till Leo Vegas, Sveriges mobilkasino. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor på leovegas.se.